in a dystopian, alternate 1920s America, where there is an imperial society, minimal social unrest, and lethal chambers for those who want to commit suicide. Hildred Castaigne has received a head injury and during his convalescence discovered the forbidden play, The King in Yellow. The head injury changes him and he slowly descends into madness, believing he is in the world of the King in Yellow and an heir to Hastur himself. Having created himself a grand delusion, and with the aid of the strange and disturbing Mr Wilde, he plots to force his cousin Louis to relinquish the imaginary title so he can take the crown himself. All in The Repairer of Reputations, the first story in the King in Yellow series by Robert W. Chambers. Link to part 1 above. To help us grow, please like, subscribe, and be sure to click the bell. But just as importantly, comment and share. The algorithm must be fed, and comments are one of its favourite meals. You might want to help guide our explorations of the strange, dark and terrible by joining the Eldritch Order on Discord. You can via our Patreon or YouTube, coming soon. We release 3 episodes a week, 2 live streams that chat guides the story on, and complete versions when a story concludes. In part 2, Castaigne climbs the dark stair to the rooms of Mr Wilde, and we hear the start of their plans. For now, it's time to enter the Cave of Chronicles. If Horbuck knew how much I loathe that word lunatic, he would never use it in my presence. It rouses certain feelings within me which I do not care to explain. However, I answered him quietly.
I think I shall drop in and see Mr Wilde for a moment or two.
Poor fellow,
said Constance with a shake of the head.
It must be hard to live alone year after year, poor, crippled, and almost demented. It's very good of you, Mr Castaigne, to visit him as often as you do.
I think he is vicious,
observed Horbuck, beginning again with his hammer. I listened to the golden tinkle on the greave plate, and when he had finished, I replied,
No, he is not vicious, nor is he in the least demented. His mind is a wonder chamber, from which he can extract treasures that you and I would give years of our life to acquire.
Horbuck laughed. I continued, a little impatiently.
He knows history as no one else could know it. Nothing, however trivial, escapes his search, and his memory is so absolute, so precise in details, that were it known in New York that such a man existed, the people could not honour him enough.
Nonsense, muttered Horbuck, searching on the floor for a falling rivet.
Is it nonsense?
I asked, managing to suppress what I felt.
Is it nonsense when he says that the tassets and cuissards of the enamelled suit of armour, commonly known as the Prince's Emblazoned, can be found among a mass of rusty theatrical properties, broken stoves and rag-pickers' refuse in a garret in Pell Street?
Horbuck's hammer fell to the ground, but he picked it up and asked, with a great deal of calm, how I knew that the tassets and left cuissard were missing from the princes emblazoned.
I did not know until Mr. Wilde mentioned it to me the other day. He said they were in the garret of 998 Pelly Street. Nonsense!
He cried, but I noticed his hand trembling under his leathern apron.
Is this nonsense too?
I asked pleasantly.
Is it nonsense when Mr. Wilde continually speaks of you as the Marquis of Avonshire and of Miss Constance?
I did not finish, for Constance had started to her feet with terror written over her every feature. Hawberk looked at me slowly and smoothed his leathern apron.
That is impossible,
he observed.
Mr. Wilde may know a great many things. About armour, for instance, and the princes emblazoned?
I interposed, smiling.
Yes,
he continued slowly.
About armour also, maybe, but he is wrong in regard to the Marquis of Avonshire, who, as you know, killed his wife's transducer years ago and went to Australia, where he did not long survive his wife.
Mr. Wilde is wrong,
murmured Constance. Her lips were blanched, but her voice was sweet and calm.
Let us agree, if you please, that in this one circumstance, Mr. Wilde is wrong, I said.
I climbed the 3 dilapidated flights of stairs, which I had so often climbed before, and knocked at a small door at the end of the corridor. Mr. Wilde opened the door and I walked in. When he had double-locked the door and pushed a heavy chest against it, he came and sat down beside me, peering up into my face with his little light-coloured eyes. 6 new scratches covered his nose and cheeks, and the silver wires which supported his artificial ears had become displaced, though I had never seen him so hideously fascinating. He had no ears. The artificial ones, which now stood out at an angle from the fine wire, were his one weakness. They were made of wax and painted a shell pink, but the rest of his face was yellow. He might better have revelled in the luxury of some artificial fingers for his left hand, which was absolutely fingerless, but seemed to cause him no inconvenience, and he was satisfied with his wax ears. He was very small, scarcely higher than a child of 10, but his arms were magnificently developed, and his thighs as thick as any athlete's. Still, the most remarkable thing about Mr. Wilde was that a man of his marvellous intelligence and knowledge should have such a head. It was flat and pointed, like the heads of many of those unfortunates whom people imprison in the asylums for the weak-minded. Many called him insane, but I knew him to be as sane as I was. I do not deny that he was eccentric. The mania he had for keeping that cat and teasing her until she flew at his face like a demon was certainly eccentric. I never could understand why he kept the creature, nor what pleasure he found in shutting himself up in his room with this surly, vicious beast. I remember once glancing up from the manuscript I was studying by the light of some tallow dips and seeing Mr. Wilde squatting motionless on his high chair, eyes fairly blazing with excitement, while the cat, which had risen from her place before the stove, came creeping across the floor right at him. Before I could move, she flattened her belly to the ground, crouched, trembled, and sprang into his face, howling and foaming, they rolled over and over on the floor, scratching and clawing until the cat screamed and fled under the cabinet, and Mr. Wilde turned over on his back, his limbs contracting and curling up like the legs of a dying spider. He was eccentric. Mr. Wilde had climbed into his high chair and, after studying my face, picked up a dog-eared ledger and opened it.
Henry B. Matthews,
He read,
bookkeeper with Weishaupt and Company, dealers in church ornaments. Called April 3rd, reputation damaged on the racetrack, known as a welcher, reputation to be repaired by August 1st, retainer $5.
He turned the page and ran his fingerless knuckles down the closely written columns.
P. Green Dunsbury, minister of the gospel, Fair Beach, New Jersey, reputation damaged in the Bowery, to be repaired as soon as possible, retainer $100.
He coughed and added,
Called April 6th. Then you are not in need of money, Mr. Wilde.
I inquired.
Listen,
He coughed again.
Mrs. C. Hamilton Chester of Chester Park, New York City, called April 7th. Reputation damaged at Dieppe, France, to be repaired by October 1st. Retainer $500. Note, C. Hamilton Chester, Captain, USS Avalanche, ordered home from South Sea Squadron, October 1st. Well,
I said.
The profession of a repairer of reputations is lucrative.
His colourless eyes sought mine.
I only wanted to demonstrate that I was correct. You said it was impossible to succeed as a repairer of reputations, that even I did succeed in certain cases, it would cost me more than I would gain by it. Today I have 500 men in my employ who are poorly paid, but who pursue the work with an enthusiasm which possibly may be born of fear. These men enter every shade and grade of society. Some even are pillars of the most exclusive social temples. Others are prop and pride of the financial world. Still others hold undisputed sway among the fancy and the talent. I chose them at my leisure, from those who reply to my advertisements. It's easy enough. They are all cowards. I could treble the number in 20 days if I wished. So you see, those who have in their keeping the reputation of fellow citizens, I have in my pay. They may turn on you,
I suggested. He rubbed his thumb over his cropped ears and adjusted the wax substitutes.
I think not.
He murmured thoughtfully.
I seldom have to apply the whip, and then only once, because they like their wages. How'd you apply the whip?
I demanded. His face, for a moment, was awful to look upon. His eyes dwindled to a pair of green sparks.
I invite them to come and have a little chat with me,
he said in a soft voice. A knock at the door interrupted him, and his face resumed its amiable expression.
Who is it?
He inquired. Mr. Stalett, was the answer.
Come tomorrow,
replied Mr. Wilde. Impossible, began the other, but was silenced by a sort of bark from Mr. Wilde.
Come tomorrow,
he repeated. We heard somebody move away from the door and turn the corner by the stairway.
Who is that?
I asked.
Arnold Stalett, owner and editor-in-chief of the Great New York Daily.
He drummed on the ledger with his fingerless hand, adding,
I pay him very badly, but he thinks it a good bargain. Arnold Stalett?
I repeated, amazed.
Yes,
said Mr Wilde with a self-satisfied cough. The cat, which had entered the room as he spoke, hesitated, looked up at him and snarled. He climbed down from the chair and, squatting on the floor, took the creature into his arms and caressed her. The cat ceased snarling and presently began a loud purring, which seemed to increase in timbre as he stroked her.
Where are the notes?
I asked. He pointed to the table, and for the 100th time I picked up the bundle of manuscript entitled The Imperial Dynasty of America. One by one I studied the well-worn pages, worn only by my own handling, and although I knew all by heart from the beginning, when from Carcosa, the Hades, Hastur and Aldebaran to Castaigne, Louis de Calvados, born December 19th, 1877, I read it with an eager, rapt attention, pausing to repeat parts of it aloud and dwelling especially on Hildred de Calvados, only son of Hildred Castaigne and Edith Landais Castaigne, first in succession, etc., etc. When I finished, Mr Wilde nodded and coughed.
Speaking of your legitimate ambition,
he said,
how do Constance and Louis get along? She loves him,
I replied simply. The cat on his knee suddenly turned and struck at his eyes, and he flung her off and climbed onto the chair opposite me.
And Dr. Archer? But that's a matter you can settle any time you wish,
he added.
Yes,
I replied.
Dr. Archer can wait, but it is time I saw my cousin Louis. It is time,
he repeated. Then he took another ledger from the table and ran over the leaves rapidly.
We are now in communication with 10,000 men,
he muttered.
We can count on 100,000 within the first 28 hours, and in 48 hours the state will rise en masse. The country follows the state, and the proportion that will not, I mean California and the Northwest, might better never have been inhabited. I shall not send them the yellow sign.
The blood rushed to my head, but I only answered,
A new broom sweeps clean. The ambition of Caesar and of Napoleon pales before that which could not rest until it had seized the minds of men and controlled even their unborn thoughts,
said Mr Wilde.
You are speaking of the King in Yellow?
I groaned with a shudder.
He is king whom emperors have served. I am content to serve him,
I replied. Mr Wilde sat rubbing his ears with his crippled hand.
Perhaps Constance does not love him,
he suggested. I started to reply, but a sudden burst of military music from the street below drowned my voice. The 20th Dragoon Regiment, formerly in garrison at Mount St Vincent, was returning from the manoeuvres in Westchester County to its new barracks on East Washington Square. It was my cousin's regiment. They were a fine lot of fellows in their pale blue, tight-fitting jackets, jaunty busbies and white riding breeches, with the double yellow stripe into which their limbs seemed moulded. Every other squadron was armed with lances, from the metal points of which fluttered yellow and white pennons. The band passed playing the regimental march. Then came the colonel and staff, the horses crowding and trampling while their heads bobbed in unison, and the pennons fluttered from their last points. The troopers who rode with the beautiful English seat looked brown as berries from their bloodless campaign among the farms of Westchester, and the music of their sabres against the stirrups, and the jingle of spurs and carbines. It was beautiful to me. I saw Lewis riding with his squadron. He was as handsome an officer as I have ever seen. Mr Wilde, who had mounted a chair by the window, saw him too, but said nothing. Lewis turned and looked straight at Hawberk's shop as he passed, and I could see the flush on his brown cheeks. I think Constance must have been at the window. When the last troopers had clattered by and the last pennons vanished into South Fifth Avenue, Mr Wilde clambered out of his chair and dragged the chest away from the door.
Yes,
He said.
it is time that you saw your cousin Lewis.
He unlocked the door, and I picked up my hat and stick and stepped into the corridor. The stairs were dark. Groping about, I set my foot on something soft, which snarled and spit. I aimed a murderous blow at the cat, but my cane shivered to splinters against the balustrade, and the beast scurried back into Mr Wilde's room. So ends part 2 of The Repairer of Reputations. In part 3, we discover more about Hildred and meet Lewis as he sets out on a walk with Constance. If you enjoyed the tale, it helps us if you let others know, so please click on the like button and share with others that may be interested. Subscribing will let you travel with us on further adventures of the dark and terrible, with the bell notifying you as we set off. If you want to join our Eldritch Order on Discord, come visit us on Patreon or YouTube, coming soon. Then you can join in the discussions and even help guide the choice of stories. There is an ever-growing list of insane benefits. See the description for details of the Patreon and for a link to Canje Studios to find out about modern board games, where you can create your own dark and terrible stories. Until next time, farewell. But think on this: who is the crazier, the madman or the man who listens to him?